Right, so I have got up at these meetings before and in Zoom meetings with volunteers and candidates and talked about what our policy platform is and gone into the weeds of all the things that we're actively campaigning on. But I thought today I might talk about the underlying principles that I guess dictate why we have those positions. Because once you understand that, you also understand what our positions are on almost everything. So as a volunteer, you might get asked some, random question by a constituent, like what's your policy on, gambling ads or, telehealth or whatever else that we're not particularly campaigning on and we don't have something in the weeds about. But if you understand the guiding principles that we derive our policies from and what libertarianism actually is, you get some sense, I guess, of an overall appreciation of what our stance on any particular thing would be. Now, you might not be able to say, well, we want to spend, this percentage of GDP on it or cut it by this much or something like that if we don't have a policy on it. But you will be able to give an answer as a volunteer if you understand the principles of libertarianism as a philosophy. So I thought I'd talk about that today and just talk about, I guess, what libertarianism is and how we build our policies from those principles. So libertarianism isn't necessarily just about the role of the state. It ends up with conclusions about the role of the state based on, I guess, some basic ethical principles. Now, there are other ethical principles that you can put next to and on top of libertarianism. Libertarianism does not answer everything, but it does answer, I guess, when the use of force is justified. So I'll go through that. So the first libertarian principle that really underlies the entire thing is self-ownership. And self-ownership does mean, it implies ownership. So it's not just we all just, exist side by side and we have to cooperate. You own yourself, and you own yourself because only the individual thinks and acts, right? So you don't have a committee meeting to determine whether or not you raise your right arm or what you think. You do that by yourself. So if you're doing that, the natural conclusion of that is that you own yourself. You own yourself, your body, your mind, your thoughts, your feelings. You own that. And if you own yourself, that's the first libertarian principle of self-ownership. So someone else doesn't own you. So that, it doesn't just mean no slavery. It has other implications, but I'll get to that. The second principle is the non-aggression principle. So it's based on the idea that if you own yourself, someone can't aggress on you with physical force or threats of force. If I own my left arm, someone else can't decide to, start chopping it off because I own it. And the third principle that I guess really ties it together is private property. So if you can own yourself, you should also be able to own other things that are in nature unowned because they don't have a conscious sentient being controlling it. And I guess the proof that I think it was John Locke went through with this in terms of why someone owning themselves also means they can own other objects and land is, let's say you own yourself and you accept that principle, but you might not necessarily agree that you can also own private property. Let's say a strawberry exists and you eat it. Now that strawberry is now part of you. So now do you say you don't own the strawberry because it was part of nature? So that also implies private property where you can own other things. So if you own yourself and you can own other things, there are lots of complicated theories about how you can actually acquire ownership of other things that we don't necessarily need to get into today. But those principles of self-ownership, non-aggression, and private property, you can basically apply that to any scenario and get a good approximation for what the libertarian answer is to something. So the question about should I be allowed to do this? The answer is it depends if it's your property or not, right? So I have an inherent right to do a handstand on my property, but not on yours. So all libertarian theory eventually gets back down to property rights. So if you get asked the question, what's your policy on this? And you're a volunteer and it's not in our policy guide, it's something random that someone just really cares about. If you think back in terms of whose property is it, that's the answer, right? So even in terms of anti-discrimination law and things like that, if it's your shop and you want to discriminate based on who you hire or if you make a cake, wedding cake or whatever, it's your property, you determine it. So it's your free speech. And in terms of other people trying to, I guess, impose free speech on other people's property, So if I own, a theatre or something, and I don't want someone with that's going to give a particular speech to do it in my theatre, it's my theatre. So it's my free speech determining what happens on my property. So that's the answer. The libertarian answer to any question is, whose property is it? And we effectively believe that every private property owner is like the absolute monarch of their property. And that also then implies very limited state intervention, because the state is not a valid property owner. The state gets all its so-called property just from stealing from us, right? Taxes and fines and things like that. So we want to take that to an absolute minimum and have the state control over other people's property, whether it's stealing from other people, preventing voluntary transactions, putting up regulations that inhibit how people can use their own property or sell it to someone else or whatever else. We want all those kept to a minimum. And some people will just, it's easy to, I guess, sell that as, we stand for freedom and small government. That's probably the best sales pitch, instead of saying what I said to the average person and talking about, John Locke eating a strawberry. So we shouldn't be selling it in this way, but I think if people understand that is the underlying philosophy, it helps volunteers and candidates have, a background that they can then use if something unexpected comes up. They know our position, and then they can think about how they want to sell it. So I think our best sales pitch is that we want, government off our backs, and we want, more money for our families, and we want to let small businesses thrive. Those are what a libertarian social order would create. So that's our selling point. So you go out there, you don't start talking about private property rights. You're talking about, how much money you get to take home and how much more time you get to spend with your family and how much more freedom you have. Those are our selling points. But I think it's important that we understand the underlying philosophy so we don't get ourselves muddled up when something unexpected comes up. And that's something that I think it's important for volunteers especially to know. One of the advantages of our party is if you're a volunteer for another party that's not really built on an underlying philosophy in that way, you have to memorize all their policies, and you have to, read the policy guide, and you have to think, oh, what if I forget this policy? And does this policy say 12% or 8%? And all that sort of stuff, because the other parties aren't internally consistent in the way we are. All our policies are based on the non-aggression principle, private property rights, self-ownership. So you really only need to know that to be able to give a reasonable answer to anything anyone asks. And that's not true for other parties because their policies aren't consistent. That's an advantage of being a libertarian, that our policies are based off a core philosophy and not just vibes or what we think will have a good outcome or that sort of thing. Now, I think, as I said, I think we should be selling good outcomes and vibes. But if you know why we believe what we do, I think you'll be more effective as a volunteer and a candidate in being able to explain things and tackle anything unexpected that comes across your way.